Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a battle or a banquet, but with something far more awkward and emotionally hazardous: dating in the Middle Ages. Because, believe it or not, finding love in a world of plagues, dowries, and ever-watchful priests was somehow even more complicated than texting at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. From tortured love poems passed under doors to courtship rituals that involved more livestock than conversation, medieval romance was less about passion and more about property. So before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy these sleepy little time travel stories. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing who's tuning in from what corner of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're standing in a muddy medieval village, or maybe inside a drafty stone hall with a tapestry that smells like onions. You see someone cute, you think, should I say something? Compliment their tunic? Mention the weather? Nope, that's not how this works. Not here, not in this century. So, you're standing in that village, or maybe a stone hall. The air is thick with wood smoke and damp wool, and somewhere a rooster sounds confused about the hour. You spot someone across the square. Your heart stirs, maybe. But here's the thing. What your heart thinks doesn't really matter. Because in the Middle Ages, love isn't something you choose. It's something that's arranged, negotiated, signed and sealed with a prayer, a blessing, and, often, a goat. Marriage was never just a personal affair. It was a business deal. And whether you were a noble with 10 acres of vineyards or a peasant with 2 pigs and a leaky roof, the rules were the same. Love came last, if it came at all. For nobles, the stakes were high. Marriages joined estates, sealed peace treaties, and produced heirs who were part of long, tangled strategies for land, influence, and survival. You might be promised to someone before you could walk. By the time you understood the word marriage, it was already decided whom you'd share your life with. The person you'd marry might be someone you'd never spoken to, someone you'd meet for the first time at the altar, or worse, someone who arrived with a lawyer and a livestock ledger. The union wasn't about compatibility, or whether you both liked honey in your porridge. It was about borders, fields, trade routes, titles. If the neighbouring baron had 3 daughters and a healthy herd, and your family needed wool and allies, then congratulations, you're engaged. And for the rest of the world, the people who lived in thatched huts and woke up with frost on their noses, the principle was the same, just less paperwork. Peasant marriages weren't written into treaties, but they were still heavily shaped by family need and local survival. You didn't marry for poetry, you married for productivity. Maybe your father noticed that the girl down the lane could carry 3 buckets of water without stopping. Maybe her family owned a productive garden or a few strong goats. That was enough. You didn't need romantic chemistry. You needed someone who could help you get through winter. And yet, even without passion, the system had its structure. Families talked, priests approved, dowries were exchanged, coins if you had them, geese if you didn't. Even in the smallest villages, marriage involved negotiation, expectation, and the ever-present sense that you weren't marrying a person, you were marrying their entire economic situation. Of course, it wasn't entirely heartless. Sometimes couples grew fond of each other. Sometimes there was a spark that managed to slip through the cracks. But even then, affection was a bonus, not a requirement. Love, if it happened, was supposed to follow marriage, never precede it. That kind of passion was reserved for songs and stories, not for real life. Falling in love before marriage, that was dangerous. Falling in love outside of marriage, that was a scandal. The church played its part too. It treated marriage as a sacrament, something sacred and binding. But even that sacredness had practical roots. A stable marriage meant a stable community. Children born into a marriage had clear inheritance. Land stayed in the right hands. That mattered far more than the flutter of a heart or the hope of a kiss. Even the language people used was transactional. You didn't say you were in love. You said you were settled, matched, brought together by God, yes, but also by grain yields and boundary lines. And so life went on. Two people, chosen by others, joined by ceremony and necessity. They shared bread, labour, and whatever warmth the fire could provide. Over time they might grow used to each other. They might share small moments of comfort, carving wood in silence, or sitting shoulder to shoulder by the hearth as the wind moaned outside. That was the goal, really. Not love as we think of it now, but peace, stability, a house with two bodies inside it, working through the years, raising children, trading eggs for cloth, and making it through the cold months together. Love was a quiet visitor, if it came at all. It wasn't chaste. It wasn't expected. It was something you might recognize only in hindsight while mending a shirt or pouring the last of the soup. And if it never came, well, the roof still needed patching. The sheep still needed feeding. You weren't waiting for passion. You were waiting for spring. And so the village sleeps. Somewhere a candle sputters. A newlywed couple, strangers by yesterday's standards, lies beneath a shared woolen blanket, not touching, not speaking, just breathing in the same cold air. The wind outside carries the sound of the trees, and maybe, just maybe, something softer beneath it, something like the very earliest stirrings of something warmer. But morning always comes, and with it, chores. The romance of the medieval world, if it existed at all, began with a shovel and ended with a prayer. Morning comes slowly in the village. The light doesn't arrive with any great ceremony, just a pale softness leaking through gaps in shutters, brushing across packed earth floors and curling around the edges of straw-stuffed bedding. Outside, the frost still clings to the well-stones, but the day has begun. And with it, so have the quiet routines of courtship, if you could even call them that. For peasants, romance didn't unfold beneath balconies or over candle-lit feasts. It happened between chores. It grew slowly, like lichen on stone, quiet, useful, and entirely unremarkable to anyone except the two people living it. If you liked someone, you didn't write them a poem. You carried their bucket when the path was icy. You left a handful of eggs on their doorstep. You noticed how they stacked kindling and thought, yes, that's someone who knows how to keep a fire going. There were no declarations, no longing glances from across banquet halls, just shared labour, walking to the mill together, gathering herbs along the edge of the woods, taking turns stirring porridge so it didn't burn. And through these moments something would sometimes begin to form. Not fireworks, not sparks, but something solid, something cooperative. Attraction for peasants was simple. You wanted someone with strong hands, a reliable stride, and a face that didn't scowl too much. A person who woke up early, didn't complain about the mud, and knew how to get through winter without drama. Having teeth helped. Not all of them. Just enough to suggest good health and the ability to chew barley bread without choking. If your heart fluttered, it was probably just indigestion from old stew. And yet, in this world of cold mornings and shared burdens, people still noticed each other, quietly, cautiously. Gifts were small and practical. A bundle of firewood left outside a door, a turnip peeled and cleaned, a spog, hand-whittled during quiet hours while the pigs snored gently nearby. These were not extravagant offerings, but they were deliberate, thoughtful. A carved spoon took time, and in a life where time was measured in daylight and labour, giving it to someone meant something. Ribbons were popular too, woven from leftover threads, dyed with onion skins or beetroot. They might be tied around a wrist or tucked into a satchel. Not flashy, but meaningful. A ribbon from someone wasn't just cloth. It was proof that somewhere between mending nets and gathering nettles, you were seen. Flirting was quiet, a comment about the weather maybe, a nod at the market, laughter during sheep shearing when the animals wriggled and bleated like wet cloth sacks. Sometimes that was all it took. a laugh shared under grey skies, a loaf of bread offered without words. And when the opportunity arose, maybe you walked someone home. Not hand in hand, there were too many eyes for that, but close enough that your footsteps matched, that was enough. Marriage, for peasants, often followed quickly. If both families agreed and there were no debts or disputes to untangle, the whole thing could be arranged in weeks. You brought a blanket, they brought a goat. Together you borrowed a pot from a cousin and hoped for a mild winter. There was no illusion of luxury. Homes were small, roofs leaked, fires smoked. But in the shared rhythm of daily survival, bonds were formed. You knew your partner's strengths, their habits, the way they bundled herbs or carried a basket of peat. Love, when it appeared, didn't arrive in a rush. It settled in quietly, like warmth creeping back into frozen hands. Some couples grew fond of each other, some didn't, but most learned to move in sync, like oxen yoked to the same plough, slow, steady, and focused on the furrow ahead. There was comfort in that, predictability, a life built not on grand gestures but on routine, on chopping turnips together, on patching roofs side by side, on sharing the weight of things too heavy to carry alone. And if now and then one of them tucked a ribbon into the other's apron without saying anything, well, that was enough. That was everything. Outside, the village continues its slow rhythm. Hooves on packed earth, crows in the trees. Somewhere, someone is repairing a fence. Someone else is grinding grain. And in a field beyond the hedges, a young man hands over a bundle of kindling to a woman with wind-chapped cheeks and a ribbon at her wrist. She doesn't say thank you. She doesn't need to. He already knows. Because in the world of peasants, love isn't a song, it's a favour returned, a chore shared, a turnip peeled, and the firewood still needs stacking. While peasants passed turnips and firewood in quiet corners of the village, far away in stone halls and candlelit chambers, love took on a very different shape. It wore silk instead of wool. It whispered in verse instead of conversation, and it almost never touched the ground. Among the nobility, romance was not a shared chore or a modest gesture. It was theatre, a carefully constructed performance of devotion, distance, and longing. They called it courtly love, and it was less about falling in love and more about appearing to suffer from it beautifully. A knight dressed in polished armour might choose a noble lady to devote himself to, not his wife, not someone single. Often it was a woman already married, already out of reach. That was the point. The ideal love was impossible, and in its impossibility it became pure, noble, untouchable. He would not confess his feelings with words. He would offer glances across crowded halls, send verses through servants, wear her colours, blue perhaps or crimson, tied to his sleeve at a tournament. He would sigh dramatically while gazing at a tapestry. He would write poetry comparing her to the moon, the stars, the divine itself, and then he would wait, sometimes for years. The lady, for her part, was expected to remain aloof, distant, mysterious. She might acknowledge him with a ribbon or a nod or a letter written in guarded language and sealed with wax, but she could not, must not, reciprocate openly. To do so would break the spell. The power of courtly love lived in its restraint, in everything left unsaid. There were rules, strict ones. You could adore but not pursue. You could pine but not touch. The knight's love was meant to ennoble him, to inspire good deeds, to fuel bravery on the battlefield. It was not about possession, it was about suffering with grace. Tournaments became stages for this devotion. A knight might ride into the arena carrying the lady's favour, perhaps a handkerchief or a strip of cloth tied to his lance. With each pass, each clash of armour and thundering hooves, he wasn't just fighting for glory, he was proving his devotion to someone who would never be his. And afterward, if he won, there might be a moment, a glance across the field, a silent bow, the briefest touch of a hand through a velvet glove. Enough to keep the illusion alive, not enough to cross the line. Of course, not everyone played by the rules. Behind the poetry and ceremony, real emotions sometimes stirred. Letters grew less subtle, glances grew longer, and occasionally, very occasionally, devotion slipped into something physical. But that was dangerous, because the entire structure of courtly love depended on boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. In a world of alliances and arranged marriages, this strange performance offered something else. It wasn't freedom, but it was an outlet, a safe space for yearning, a ritual for those who longed for beauty in a life shaped by duty. Courtly love was never meant to result in marriage. That was its charm. It was love without consequence, pain without risk, a dream held at arm's length, polished like a relic, too delicate for reality. And so, across the castles and courts of Europe, this tradition endured, a silent language of glances and verses, of tokens tied to swords, of longing set to the rhythm of lute strings and candlelight. The knight remained a figure of restless devotion, the lady a distant beacon of grace and virtue, and the love they shared, if it could be called that, remained locked in ritual high above the mess of real life. It was a different kind of romance, not rooted in earth and sweat like the peasants, not built on practical needs or winter survival. This love floated, untethered, beautiful, imagined, safe. And in a world of arranged futures and rigid roles, maybe that was the point, to create a space where longing could live, even if only in secret, even if only in verse. Outside, the castles stand silent under starlight. Banners shift gently in the wind. A knight walks alone through the courtyard, his footsteps echoing on stone. In his hand, a ribbon. In his mind, a poem he will never recite. And high in a window above, a lady turns away from the cold glass. She doesn't look down, because the performance, as always, must continue. The candlelight fades in the great hall. Outside, a fog gathers quietly along the hedges. And inside these stone walls, where voices are hushed and footsteps muffled by old tapestries, love still moves, but only through symbols, through quiet gestures, wrapped in layers of meaning. In this world, affection isn't spoken plainly. It's wrapped inside objects, small cryptic offerings passed from hand to hand like a secret, each one carefully chosen, heavy with implication. They're called tokens. A ribbon, a glove, a sleeve embroidered with initials, even a single feather tucked into the fold of a tunic. These weren't simply decorations, they were messages, and yet no message was ever fully clear. Because in the medieval world, where directness was dangerous and most feelings had consequences, tokens were how you said something without really saying it. You couldn't write a love note without risking scandal. You couldn't speak your heart without someone listening, someone who might whisper it in the wrong ear. But a ribbon, that could mean anything or nothing, and that was exactly the point. A glove pinned to a knight's armour might mean, I adore you, or I admire your swordsmanship, or please don't speak to me in public ever again. The meaning was left unspoken, floating in the space between the sender and the receiver. That space, the ambiguity, that's where medieval love lived, and that made it dangerous. Because one wrong ribbon, one misunderstood sleeve, and you weren't just admired, you were attached, bound by implication, sometimes even assumed to be promised. A token wasn't just a symbol, it was a declaration, and sometimes a trap. There were rules, but they were unwritten, whispered from older cousins, reinforced by sidelong glances. You gave a token carefully, never directly. You received it with caution, and if someone saw you wearing one, that meant something. Too. Even how it was worn carried weight. Tied to a sword hilt meant devotion. Pinned near the heart meant longing. Wrapped around a wrist? Well, no one could agree on what that meant, which made it perfect. Because in this world, confusion was safer than clarity. Tokens weren't limited to the noble courts. In villages, among thatched roofs and smoky hearths, they existed too, simpler but just as meaningful, a carved wooden charm, a woven band of thread, a feather, a shell, a pressed flower folded into a corner of cloth. None of these things spoke aloud, but they told stories, and for those who understood, they said more than any letter ever could. Still, the meaning could always shift. A token received with a smile might lead to quiet hopes. A token returned without comment might be the gentlest refusal, or the most devastating. People watched, not just the lovers, but everyone around them. Servants noticed when a glove was missing. Priests noticed when a knight lingered near the same seat. Gossip, slow and deliberate, drifted through corridors and courtyards like chimney smoke. You never knew who knew what, and that was part of the thrill and the risk. Because while tokens offered a way to express affection, they also allowed for denial. You could always say it meant nothing, that the ribbon was just decoration, that the carved spoon was simply useful, that the flower fell into your pocket by accident. You could lie, or pretend, or simply stay silent. And that silence, fragile, charged, sacred, became the language of love. Some tokens crossed long distances, carried by servants or scribes, wrapped in cloth, pressed with wax, passed in secret. These were the more serious kind. A glove sent through a courier, a page torn from a psalter, its edge kissed and folded, and sometimes even a lock of hair tucked between pages and sent on a prayer. These tokens might never be acknowledged. They might be hidden in chests, sewn into garments or buried in fields, but they mattered deeply because they were proof that someone, somewhere, was thinking of someone else in a way they couldn't say aloud. And so the ritual continued. In stalls and cottages alike, objects passed from one hand to another. A ribbon left on a bench, a glove dropped in a corridor, a spoon laid gently on a windowsill. No names, no promises, just signals wrapped in silence. And still the night deepens. The hall sleeps. The fire settles into soft orange coals. Somewhere beneath a heavy quilt, a ribbon is hidden inside a linen sleeve. And somewhere beyond the hedges, a knight turns that same sleeve in his hands beneath the moonlight, not quite sure what it means. But still, he keeps it. Because in the world of tokens, meaning isn't fixed. It's felt, quietly, in the dark. The ribbon has been given, the glove perhaps received, but nothing, no gift, no glance, no gesture, happens unnoticed. Because in the medieval world, romance was never a private affair. There were too many eyes, too many ears. Love, if it existed at all, had to squeeze itself into the narrow spaces between tradition, suspicion, and the rustle of someone else's skirts. The moment two people came too close, there was someone there to notice, a chaperone, an elder, a passing priest, or a watchful cousin who just happened to be sweeping the threshold again. Privacy wasn't a concept, it was a fantasy. In noble houses, young women were rarely alone. Their days unfolded within carefully controlled spaces, gardens enclosed by high walls, chambers with heavy curtains but always open doors. Every movement was catalogued, observed, and quietly reported. Even walking in the orchard wasn't innocent. If a noble woman was seen strolling among the apple trees, someone followed, usually a trusted aunt or an older servant who remembered the rules better than the young ones ever could. And for men, things weren't so free either. Their presence near certain doors raised eyebrows. Lingering too long near a window earned quiet questions. Every letter they sent risked being intercepted. Every message passed by servant or scribe was fair game for review. The church, of course, watched over it all. Romance, like everything else, had to bow to doctrine. The clergy decided who could marry whom, when, and why. And if someone tried to bypass the rules, there were consequences. Marriage without approval wasn't just frowned upon, it could be declared invalid. Entire unions unravelled because a bishop wasn't consulted first. And yet people still tried. Letters were sent in secret, meetings arranged during feast days when the crowd made hiding easier, a brief touch beneath a linen cloth, a whispered scent, ents between blessings. But even then, someone was always nearby, a sister, a servant, a silent observer, holding a candle just a bit too close. In villages, the surveillance looked different, but it was just as present. Doors stayed open, windows were few, gossip moved faster than fire. One glance shared at the well could turn into a full romance by the time the bread came out of the oven. Elders watched from porches, spinning wool and taking mental notes. Children listened, then repeated what they heard. The village priest knew everything, whether you told him or not. And once something became common knowledge, it could shape your future without warning. Even letters weren't safe. If you managed to find someone who could write and trusted someone else to deliver it, there was still the risk. Seals could be broken, parchment unfolded quietly behind closed doors. If the contents were suspicious or simply too heartfelt, they could be read aloud to others, dissected, judged, condemned. Nothing written was ever truly private. Ink lasted longer than feelings, and once a letter left your hands, it might never return. So lovers, if they existed, learned to adapt. They wrote in code. They used metaphors so layered that even they might forget what they meant. They chose their messengers carefully, often paying in favours rather than coin. And they practiced the art of ambiguity, saying something in a way that could always be explained away later. I meant nothing by it. It was only a gift. I was only being polite. These became shields, soft defences in a world where curiosity carried real consequences. Even weddings weren't private. Ceremonies required witnesses, approvals, announcements read from the church steps. A union wasn't official until it was seen, recorded, and agreed upon by nearly everyone in the room. And if someone objected, if a hand went up at the wrong moment, everything could be paused, questioned, undone. In this landscape, love couldn't just happen. It had to navigate layers of scrutiny. It had to survive whispers, survive watchfulness, survive the slow turning of heads every time you walked past. And still, somehow, it did. Not often, not easily. But somewhere between the embroidered sleeves and opened letters, it found a way to hide in plain sight. In the pause before someone entered the room, in the breath between two verses of a song, in the stillness just after the church bell rang, when for one brief second no one was looking. Outside, the night deepens. A candle flickers in a window. A servant closes a door quietly, eyes lingering for just a moment too long. Behind stone walls and oak panels, someone watches. Someone always watches. And yet, in the soft silence between footsteps, a ribbon changes hands. There are still things that can't be said aloud, not in front of chaperones, not under the eyes of the church, not with gossip curling like smoke through halls and hedges. But in ink, on parchment, those thoughts can finally breathe. A letter becomes the only place where feeling is allowed to speak. And in the medieval world, writing one isn't just a small act, it's a risk, a quiet rebellion. Love letters, when they were written, didn't speak plainly. They couldn't. There were no straightforward admissions, no clear declarations. Instead, they were laced with metaphors, draped in borrowed language, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in borrowed scripture, and always in symbols heavy enough to sink under their own meaning. You didn't say, "I miss you." You might say, "The moon wanes without your light." You didn't write, "I love you." You might write, "You are the blessed flame that warms my cold prayer." To outsiders, it was poetry. To the person reading it, it was everything. The letter itself was rarely written by the sender's own hand. Among nobles, not everyone was literate. Words had to be dictated to someone trusted, usually a scribe, a priest, or a well-read sibling who could keep a secret. Sometimes the scribe didn't know what they were writing. The phrases were vague enough to pass for devotional texts, lines lifted from songs or prayers. Once written, the letter had to be folded carefully. It was sealed with wax, sometimes perfumed, sometimes pressed with a ring or a thumbprint. Then came the harder part, getting it to the right hands. This required messengers, a servant already loyal, a sister sympathetic to secrets, a stable boy willing to be silent. In some cases, even monks were bribed, those who travelled between abbeys and noble homes, carrying scripture and gossip in equal measure. The journey from one hand to another was rarely direct. The letter might pass the sod, rough kitchens, across market stalls, under cloaks, inside books of psalms. It might travel for days before reaching its intended reader, and when it arrived, it had to be read in secret, behind locked doors, by firelight, and then hidden deep in a trunk, inside a pillow, beneath floorboards. Sometimes they were never sent at all, written, sealed, and then left in a drawer, too dangerous to deliver. A confession meant only for parchment, a private flood of words never meant to reach the shore. But when they did reach their destination, they became lifelines. In a world where eyes watched every move, letters were the one place where longing could exist without witness. Of course, not every letter survived its journey. Some were intercepted, opened, misunderstood. The wrong metaphor, a phrase too vivid, a line too passionate, could be taken as a scandal, a sin, something that required penance. The church didn't ignore these letters. In some cases, if a priest found one, he might report it, or use it as leverage, or offer spiritual correction, which often meant confession, punishment, and a vow to never write again. Even so, people kept writing. Because despite the risks, the letter was freedom, a chance to speak when the mouth had to remain silent, to name something fragile and fleeting, even if only for a moment. And somehow, some of those letters survived, folded into the bindings of old books, pressed flat between pages, discovered centuries later in crumbling archives, their ink faded but still legible, the voices inside them still speaking, quietly, carefully, from across time. They tell stories that never reached their endings, love that bloomed and then disappeared, promises made in metaphors, desires woven into lines of poetry, each one a moment captured, a feeling caught like breath on cold glass. Among peasants, letters were rarer, but not unheard of. In some cases, travelling priests or merchants offered to write messages. The words might be simple, more about intention than ornament. A short note passed at a festival, a name carved into bark, even a few words scratched onto slate and delivered like treasure. The weight of a letter wasn't in its length or its elegance, but in its existence. It meant someone had risked something to reach you: time, safety, secrecy. It meant they'd thought of you, even when they shouldn't have. And in that thought, pressed into parchment, there was warmth. Outside, the world remains still. Snow gathers softly on rooftops. The fire crackles low, nothing more than ember and memory. And tucked beneath a wool blanket, someone holds a folded square of parchment, read a dozen times, maybe more. The wax seal long broken, the words half memorized, but still it's held, because for all its risks, love written down is a kind of proof, and in the silence of this medieval night, it's enough. The letter has been read, then hidden again, folded into silence, and as the days pass, routine returns, chores, prayers, the rhythm of village life. Most hours offer little room for feeling, let alone romance. But sometimes, rarely, the world allows a break in the pattern, a festival. These were few and far between, often tied to saints' days, harvests, or the thinning line between seasons. They came as brief windows in otherwise ordinary lives. The bells would ring louder, fires would burn longer, and the usual weight of propriety would lift, just slightly. Not entirely, never entirely, but enough to breathe. It was during these times, when banners were hung and bread baked with extra care, that people could speak without words. Flirtation didn't arrive in declarations. It arrived in footsteps, in dancing, in the way one person lingered just a little longer near another. The space was still watched. Elders sat along the benches, cups in hand, eyes alert beneath heavy brows. Priests lingered by the chapel doors. But there was more movement, more noise, and in that swirl of activity something else could bloom. Dancing especially became a language of its own. Not the wild, spinning kind seen in taverns after too much ale, but the structured steps of village reels or courtly processions, movements practiced and repeated yet never entirely the same. Each hand offered during a turn was a quiet chance, each circle around the fire a moment to test nearness, to meet a gaze and hold it just a second longer than usual. A hand brushing another, a shared rhythm, the feel of a sleeve's fabric, the warmth of a palm beneath worn linen. It meant nothing, but it might have meant something. For many, this was the only time touching was allowed at all. Outside of family or necessity, physical contact was rare, but within the bounds of a festival, during a dance or a ritual offering, closeness was permitted, monitored, yes, but permitted. And so these moments were treasured, memorized, replayed long after the fire burned low and the ribbons were taken down. A single handhold could linger in the mind for days. A shared laugh near the cider barrel could become a quiet source of warmth through the weeks that followed. Trinkets were exchanged too, not the expensive kind, but simple carvings, scraps of cloth, little gestures offered in the cover of celebration. A piece of dyed thread, a carved whistle, a coin polished clean and marked with a thumbprint. Nothing of real value, yet heavier than gold when given with intention. Each item had its own unspoken meaning. I noticed you. I remember your face. You were the one I danced with when the music slowed. Of course, this openness came with risk. One wrong glance, one gift accepted in the wrong way, one hand held for too long, and the whispers began. Not immediately, but soon, passed in church pews, murmured over fences, written into the soft fabric of village memory, where nothing ever truly faded. 6 weeks of gossip could grow from a single moment, a brush of fingers mistaken for a proposal, a shared cup misunderstood as a vow, and there was little chance to explain, because no one asked what it meant. They only remembered that it happened. And so each gesture carried weight. It had to be given carefully and received with equal care, because while festivals opened doors, they also left them ajar for watching eyes. Even in noble courts, where celebration was laced with luxury, the same rules applied. Dances were slower, the clothes finer, but the glances and tokens were just as subtle. A fan opened at a certain angle, a cup handed off with 2 hands instead of 1, all of it coded, all of it deliberate. And in both worlds, village and castle alike, these small openings became memories people returned to, not because they led to anything lasting, often they didn't, but because they reminded people of something delicate, something possible. Outside, the fires from the festival have long faded. Ash drifts in the breeze, carried over frost-covered grass. Inside the cottages, the music still hums faintly in memory. A hand reaches into a pocket, fingers closing around a small wooden carving, rough, uneven, but familiar. It isn't spoken of, but it's held. Because sometimes love isn't built from grand stories. Sometimes it grows from the pause between two drum beats, the shape of a dance, the silence after a smile, and that's enough. The music has faded, the trinkets have been tucked away, and the festival grounds, once alive with laughter and firelight, now lie quiet beneath the morning fog. Another day begins, as all others do, with chores and frost and the sound of geese somewhere near the stream. And for many, that day begins beside someone they didn't choose. Because in the medieval world, marriage wasn't the ending of a story. It wasn't a grand reward for love or longing. It was the beginning of something quieter, more practical, often disappointing. For most, marriage was arranged, or at least expected, negotiated by parents, shaped by economics, approved by priests. By the time two people stood before the altar, there was little left to decide, and once the vows were made, there was no going back. Divorce, as we understand it today, didn't exist. Not for ordinary people. The church permitted annulments under very specific conditions. If the marriage hadn't been consummated, or if one partner was discovered to be too closely related or previously betrothed. But these were rare, complicated, and usually available only to the wealthy or well-connected. For everyone else, marriage was binding, a knot tied with rope that frayed slowly over time but never quite came loose. If the match was kind, or at least cooperative, the days settled into rhythm. Shared work, shared meals, shared winters. Maybe not love, but something close to understanding, familiarity, the sense that you were moving forward together even if the path was muddy and narrow. But not every match was kind. Some were made in haste, others under pressure, and over the months, then years, the tension grew. Voices lowered, glances cooled, and silence stretched across dinner tables made of rough planks and cold bread. Still, people stayed, because they had no other choice. To leave would mean shame, exile, poverty. Women, especially, weaker, rebound by the weight of the church, of community, of inheritance. A wife who left her husband might lose her home, her children, her reputation. So she stayed, sometimes in quiet suffering, sometimes in resignation, sometimes because it was simply easier. Men too could feel trapped. A bad match meant constant tension, a house that echoed with things unsaid, and though they had more freedom, they too were bound by duty, by expectation, by the eyes of others. In some cases, people adapted. They learned to live beside someone they didn't love. They shared a roof, a bed, a routine, and over time the edges wore down, not into passion, but into tolerance, a quiet truce, an agreement to endure. Children were born, seasons passed, faces aged, and through it all the marriage endured, not because it was joyful, but because it simply had to. Romance, if it returned at all, came slowly. Sometimes it surprised them both, years later during a quiet moment by the fire, or while mending a garment together in silence, a hand placed gently on a shoulder, a memory shared without bitterness, a glance that softened for the first time in years. But more often the love they imagined never arrived, and instead they simply adjusted, the same way you adjust to cold floors or thin soup. Not ideal, but survivable. Of course, some looked elsewhere. Discreet affairs happened, though rarely without risk. A glance too long, a meeting in the fields, a secret exchanged beneath the old oak near the well. These liaisons were dangerous, socially, spiritually, physically. But for some, they were the only escape from the weight of a loveless bond. Others turned inward, to prayer, to drink, to long walks beyond the hedges, not to find someone new, but to reclaim a small piece of themselves away from the shared routine of daily life. And through it all, the village or the manor watched quietly. They knew who smiled and who didn't, who slept in separate rooms, who sang while working and who stayed silent. But nothing was said outright, not unless things grew loud. Most marriages remained private in their disappointments, visible only in tone, in posture, in the way one name was never mentioned when the other spoke. Still, life continued. The fire still needed stoking, the animals still needed feeding. Whether happy or not, the couple was bound together, not by romance, but by survival, by duty, by the sheer momentum of the days. And sometimes that was enough. Not joyous, not tragic, just steady. Two people moving side by side, not hand in hand, but shoulder to shoulder, enduring not out of love, but out of necessity. Outside, the wind stirs the thatch. A candle flickers near the hearth. A wife scrubs a pot while her husband sharpens a tool. Neither speaks, neither smiles. But when the fire sputters, one rises to feed it, and the other pulls the pot from the heat before it burns. And in that there is something, not happiness, but something. The days pass quietly now, the routine settled, two people sharing space, enduring what cannot be changed. But not every story ends in silence. Some, instead, bend unexpectedly toward freedom. And sometimes that freedom arrives only after loss. Widowhood, while sombre, could offer something few others in the medieval world ever touched: autonomy. For the first time, a woman might find herself outside the shadow of someone else's authority. No husband to obey, no father arranging her next move. If the household passed to her and there were no brothers or sons to take it away, she could manage land, settle debts, choose her path. Not all widows gained this space. Some were remarried quickly, pulled back into the cycle of alliance and arrangement. But others, especially older women or those with some wealth, found themselves alone, and for the first time free. It wasn't freedom in the way we imagine it, but it was enough to breathe, to make decisions, to say no softly without consequence. Some remarried, but on their own terms. Some chose companionship without marriage at all, quiet partnerships, discreet affections. And others chose solitude, growing herbs in the garden behind the cottage, offering advice to younger women who still lived within tighter boundaries. Then there were the bold ones, those who did not wait for permission. Noble women who fled their homes under cover of night. Young men who leapt fences and abandoned titles to follow a forbidden love. Elopements were rare and messy, but they happened. Two people, bound not by duty, but by want, would disappear. To a distant village, to a coastal chapel, anywhere far enough from family and law to begin again. And in their wake, chaos followed. Scandal, rumour, the slow unravelling of carefully woven plans. For the noble class, these stories were dramatic. A broken engagement could destroy alliances, a runaway. Marriage could upend inheritance. Titles were delicate things, balanced on names and bloodlines. To run away for love was to set fire to those threads. But sometimes they did, driven not by poetry, but desperation, a need to escape, to belong to each other in a world that forbade it. For monks and nuns, the story was quieter and sadder. Hidden behind cloistered walls, where vows had been spoken and habits worn like second skin, some hearts still stirred, in the garden, in the library, during evening prayers, glances shared in silence, a book passed with too much care. They had taken vows, of silence, of chastity, of obedience, but they were still human. Most never acted on it. The risks were too high, the shame too heavy. But some did, in secret, in stolen moments, and when they were caught, the consequences were swift. Removal, punishment, penance, sometimes exile, sometimes worse. But the stories remain, hidden in old records, mentioned in whispers, proof that even in the most controlled places, love found cracks to grow through. Even among the poor, who lacked titles, land, or recorded history, love sometimes defied expectation. A servant and a merchant, a miller's daughter and a travelling mason, people who should not have met, who should not have cared, but did anyway. Their unions weren't always tragic. Sometimes they succeeded. A home built in spite of warnings, a life made in defiance of rules, not with fanfare, but with quiet persistence. What these stories share isn't just love, it's risk, the choice to want in a world that punished wanting, the decision to act, however gently, against a current that pushed everyone into their proper place. Not all of them ended well. Some were separated, some punished, some forgotten by history entirely, but some somehow endured. A widow tending her own field, a former novice sewing in a village far from the abbey, two people living under new names in a distant valley where no one knew what had been left behind. And in these lives, something tender survived, not passion in the loud, poetic sense, but something steadier, calmer, a sense of having chosen, a quiet defiance turned into a quiet life. Outside, the sky turns the colour of cold ash, a fire cracks in the hearth, and across the fields the silhouette of two figures walks slowly, side by side, toward a home with no nameplate, no crest, no history, just warmth. Because not every love was allowed, but some still happened. The lovers walk into the distance, their footsteps quiet, their past forgotten, or at least forgiven by time. But even in that fragile peace, something else continues to linger above them. Something older than rules, deeper than gossip, the stars. In the medieval world, love was never simply between two people. It was never just the rhythm of glances or the slow bloom of affection. It was also celestial, calculated, cast in charts drawn by candlelight and interpreted by men who believed that fate was something written in the heavens. Astrology was not entertainment, it was instruction. A nobleman considering a marriage might consult the position of Venus. A farmer planning a wedding would ask when Mercury would next rise without mischief. The hour of your birth, the shape of the moon, the moment of the first meeting, it all mattered. All of it was seen as sign and signal. If the stars warned against a union, many would hesitate. If they aligned in harmony, even the most reluctant families might soften. It was a logic older than law, passed down through generations and cloaked in mystery. But it wasn't just the stars that guided love, it was everything around you. Superstitions whispered like wind through the hedgerows. If a raven flew over your path before you met someone's eyes, it was seen as a warning. If you dropped a spoon while baking bread for a feast, it meant someone uninvited would soon arrive. A sudden chill while sitting beside a suitor, a sign your ancestors disapproved. Even birthmarks had meaning. A red spot shaped like a heart might be called a blessing. One shaped like a dagger. Well, people noticed. They remembered. They told stories about it long after the person had gone. These signs weren't always believed, but they were rarely ignored. In a world so governed by uncertainty, where storms ruined crops and illness arrived without reason, people turned to signs for comfort, for control, and love, being as unpredictable as weather, demanded its own kind of reading. Sometimes these signs saved people from disappointment, other times they kept them from something real, a pairing dismissed because their signs didn't match, a feeling ignored because it came on the wrong day, in the wrong moon, beneath the wrong stars. And still, despite all that, people fell in love. Bravely, awkwardly, often in ways that couldn't be explained by charts or birds or candle wax. A merchant's daughter and a man with calloused hands. a widow and a healer, a monk and a song, feelings that bloomed despite the warnings, unions that held despite the odds. Because while astrology gave people a sense of order, love was never orderly. It didn't ask permission. It didn't read the sky first. It simply happened. And perhaps that was its power. In a world full of rules, of arranged matches, of censored letters, of chaperoned dances and whispered prayers, love that defied those structures became sacred in its own quiet way. Even the stars, eventually, were forgotten or forgiven, because two people sitting beside each other through the long, dark winter mattered more than what the heavens had to say. Outside now, the village sleeps. The sky overhead is clear, pricked with stars. A wolf howls far off, but the cottages remain calm. Inside, someone turns beneath a wool blanket. Another pours water into a clay cup and settles into a chair near the hearth. And somewhere, someone looks up at the moon and remembers a name they once carved into wood. The love stories of the Middle Ages were not all poetry or disaster. They were not always grand or even particularly romantic. Most were quiet, some were awkward, many were shaped by duty or chance. And yet in the cracks of those constraints, love still found space to grow, sometimes in defiance, sometimes in surrender, sometimes only for a moment, but always there, somewhere between the fields and the stars. And as the fire fades and the last candle gives up its glow, that's what remains. Not the marriages, not the ceremonies, not the rules, but the moments in between, a ribbon passed quietly, a dance beneath a banner, a letter folded 3 times and hidden in linen, and the simple, unshakable truth that even in a time when everything was watched, warned and weighed, people still risked falling in love, because even back then, some part of the heart belonged to no one but itself.